Welcome to St Mary's Church, Petworth, and to the Petworth Festival Autumn Special. If we haven't met before, I'm Stuart Collins, the Artistic Director, and welcome to this live literary event on what is for us the penultimate day of this year's rather exceptional festival. Exceptional in the sense that not too many festivals will be happening this year, as you probably know. Before I introduce William Boyd, can I just firstly remind you that if you're watching live, we are taking questions live online, which will be pinged to us on stage. So do please send those in. It's very clear where to do that on the website. And can I also say that, as I always do prior to our events, that the festival this year, because of the extraordinary circumstances under which we are presenting it, we have only been able to do so because of the extraordinary generosity of a whole group of sponsors. We show that list of sponsors on a slide at the end of the event, so I do hope you'll look at that because there's many, many names, and we're extremely grateful for their support. And perhaps I could ask our audience who are here live in St Mary's Church to give them a round of applause to say thank you. Thank you. And we'd also like to thank our media partners, Scala Radio. If you're not watching this live, you obviously can't send in questions, but as with all of the festival events, the literary festival events, and most of the music events, they will still be available to watch until Saturday, the 6th of November, so I hope you'll join us and have a look at those before the end of this particular run of events. But for now, it's an incredible delight to be able to welcome for what is his only live literary festival appearance this year, the brilliant, the prolific William Boyd.
Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody who's here tonight and everyone watching online or watching in the future. I have a plan, you'll be glad to hear. I'm going to wander around a bit. I might return to this lectern from time to time to check my notes. I mustn't overrun. But I'm going to talk to you initially about my new novel, Trio. And then I'm going to tell you two stories about the literary life that I've led. One of them a bit admonitory, one of them strange, but with a happy ending. You'll be glad to hear. But this is my 16th novel, Trio. I'm sort of rather amazed that it's number 16. Number 1 was published in January 1981, so I'm heading for my 40th anniversary of A Good Man in Africa, and I'm still here, still standing. The show is on the road. In a way, that's the most important thing. But I can now look back over a body of work and make some judgment calls. And one of the strangest things about writing a novel is where the ideas come from. And sometimes it can be as simple as one sentence resonating in your head or something you've seen. And the same applies to short stories as well. But every novel somehow seems to have its own starting point. And in the case of Trio, it was a very strange idea that I had. I got this idea of people having secrets. As simple as that. And then I had this notion of writing 3 distinct short stories about different people or different person with a secret. And then I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll write the short stories, I'll have them bound up in bright, distinct colors, red, blue, purple, say, and then put them in a slipcase and invite the reader to choose how he or she would like to start reading, construct their own narrative. I can see you're already thinking, bad idea, Boyd. But it might have worked, actually, but it was clearly a gimmick, and it wasn't going to be anything more than a curio. But the idea had kind of lodged in my brain, this idea of 3 people with secret lives, and people who are keeping secrets. And that was the beginning of Trio. And I thought to myself, it's true, we're all a bit mysterious and a bit opaque, and our secret lives are something that we guard and cherish and nurture ourselves. But then I came across a quote from Chekhov, who's currently occupying #1 in my personal hit parade of writers. And Chekhov said, most people live their real, most interesting lives under cover of secrecy. Well, you define real, define most interesting. But that was the push I needed to begin thinking about my trio of characters and the secrets they were keeping. And so I evolved this idea that the secret lives of these individuals would eventually overwhelm their public lives, the face that they present to the world at large. And then I began the process that has been true of all the novels I've written, which is a simple series of questions and answers. Who are these people? What sex are they? How old are they? Where do they live? How much money do they earn? And the answers I get to those questions trigger more questions and more answers. And slowly but surely, I find I begin to build an aggregate of information about these people and about the story that I'm going to tell about them. And then it becomes more and more precise. I decided, because I've worked a lot in the film industry, that I would set the novel in the context of the making of a film. Another question, when? I've been writing a lot about the 1960s, a very intriguing decade to me. And so I decided to set the novel in the year 1968. Interesting year. Could be argued it was a pivotal year, one of those years like 1848 or 1914 or 1933, where something in the world changed. Maybe they'll be saying the same about 2020 when you come to think about it. But in 1968, the world was in a state of some confusion. It seemed to be going to hell in a handcart, not to put too fine a point on it. The Vietnam War was raging. The Tet Offensive had begun in January 1968. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Then Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, and there were huge riots in America, the worst civil disturbance since the American Civil War. In France and in Germany and in Italy, there were student-led uprisings that had a massive effect on society. It was almost another French Revolution. But here in Britain, what was on our minds? Were the Beatles going to stay together, or would they break up? That's facetious, of course, that we had our own problems, but most commentators realized that while the world was in this turmoil, life in Britain in 1968 was pretty normal. No, not even normal, it was the swinging 60s. It was hedonistic, it was frivolous, it was flippant. And nothing better summed up that flippancy and frivolousness in a way than certain types of British movies that were being made at the time. They all were slightly zany, very sort of with it, very cool, a lot of music, and they all seem to advertise this wacky, zany mood by strange titles, long titles. I'll just rattle off a few of them. There was a film called 30 is a Dangerous Age, Cynthia. There was another film called I'll Never Forget What's His Name. Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush. I don't know if any of you have seen these films, but they all have a similar kind of character. So I decided to invent a film that was like this, with a kind of very contemporary vibe to it. And I invented a title and called the film Emily Bracegirdle's Extremely Useful Ladder to the Moon. Now, you may think that's silly, but in a way, the template for my silly title was a film that was made again in the same year, directed by and starring Anthony Newley and starring his then wife Joan Collins, and its title was Can Hieronymus Merkin Ever Forget Mercy Hump and Find True Happiness? True. So my title doesn't seem so silly at all. But I decided to set the film in this context of the movie, and I set it in Brighton, of all places, which is not too far away. Why Brighton? I think it's something to do with I have this vague obsession with East Sussex. I keep putting East Sussex in my novels. Maybe now I'm here, I'll start putting West Sussex in my novels as well. But I decided to set the novel largely in Brighton. There's a bit in London, there's a bit in Paris. And the three characters that I chose to represent my trio are a novelist called Elfrida Wing, who's in fact a raging alcoholic, that's her secret, who's married to the director of the film, the producer of the film, who's a man in his 60s, very distinguished, good war record, called Talbot Kidd, and a young American actress who's a huge movie star, who is the lead in this film, called Annie Viklund. And this is my trio, and the secrets they're all keeping are the respective motors that drive the story of the novel. I'm not going to tell you any more about it because I don't want to spoil the pleasure of the eventual read, I hope. But that is how the novel began, and that's how it evolved, and how it took shape in my head after a long process of question and answers and research and reading and looking at photographs and street maps of Brighton and so on. Finally, I had written the outline of the novel. I knew how it was going to end, and this is another thing that I always do. I don't start until I know the ending of my novel, and I had got an end clear in my head. I actually wrote the end, the last paragraph or two, before I wrote page one. So that's my method, but it gives me a destination, gives me something to write towards, and so I write not particularly fast, but I write with confidence, and Trio was the eventual outcome of that. One of the things I did, and actually what I'm going to do, I'm going to read you a little passage from it, just to give you a flavor of it. It's from the beginning of the novel, and it's about Elfrida Wing, the novelist with a drink problem. And she's in Brighton, in a pub, and thinking about things. Elfrida stood at the bar of the Snug in the Repulse and ordered another gin and tonic. It was the pub she preferred in Brighton, 2 streets back from the Esplanade, smallish, with a saloon bar as well as the Snug, and decoratively unfavored. It boasted only drab, neutral colors, browns, greens, dark grey, nothing themed, nothing garish. No music blaring, no gambling machines, or toys for men to play. It was named the Repulse after an early 19th century first-rate ship of the line that went down with all hands in some remote naval battle in the East Java Sea or somewhere far from England anyway, forever commemorated here in a modest Brighton pub, paid for by subscriptions raised by the widows of the crew. There was a framed parchment document in the short corridor on the way to the saloon bar that explained the history. Nice idea, Elfrida thought. A fit way of remembering the drowned menfolk, a place where you could drown your sorrows. She thought she'd quite like a pub as a memorial, better than a row of books on a shelf. A little pub somewhere with a sign, the Elfrida Wing. She took her drink back to her table in the corner, toying with the idea, imagining the pub, her stylized portrait on the sign, bright flowers in window boxes, benches outside, a little beer garden at the back. Anyway, you can tell, and from that little section, that I'm actually a thoroughly realistic novelist. I try to make the worlds of my novel as absolutely textured and authentic and plausible as possible, to such an extent that very often I put real people in the novel and mingle them with my fictional characters. In this case, I haven't done it quite as much as I've done in the past, but the widower of Virginia Woolf, Leonard Woolf, features in a scene in this novel when Elfrida goes to their house, Monk's house at Rodmill Village, sort of seeking the ghost of Virginia Woolf, and she has an interesting encounter with Leonard. You might ask, why do I do this? Why do I mingle real people with my fictional characters? And I think, broadly speaking, it's an attempt that I've done, and again, with wisdom of hindsight, I can look back. I try to push my fiction so far into the world of the real that readers begin to suspect its fictive status, if you like. The line between fiction and fact, the border becomes blurry and obscure. And that uncertainty, I think, is a very, very useful thing to do for a novelist, particularly a realistic novelist, competing against all the 24-hour news channels and documentaries and histories and newspapers and facts that we're bombarded with 24/7. The novel can compete with that noise, and this is one method of making it happen. I have a little manifesto that I want to read out as well. It's something that I read that a Serbian novelist, now dead, called Danilo Kiš, came up with, and I've sort of manipulated it slightly to fit my own fiction. And Kiš said, words to this effect, I paraphrase, "The key factor in fiction is to make your readers believe in the truth of your story. They must believe that what they are reading actually happened." And I completely concur with that. I completely believe that. And so everything I do, I try to bring that about, to make people suspend their disbelief and believe in the fiction that I've created for them. In my second novel, this leads me on to one of the anecdotes, which was called An Ice Cream War, I did the same thing again. It's a novel about the First World War in East Africa, a kind of forgotten war between the two colonies there, the British East Africa, as it's known, and German East Africa, now Kenya and now Tanzania, went to war in 1914, and I wrote a novel about this war. And I set my fictional characters down in real historical events and had them encounter real historical characters. There was a very famous battle. It's gone down in history as possibly the worst battle that any British troops have ever fought in, called the Battle of Tanga, where they were severely defeated by a tiny force of Germans and their Askaris. And the Brigadier General who was leading the British troops at the Battle of Tanga was called Brigadier General Tighe, T-I-G-H-E. And I put his name in the book. And when it was published, I got an anguished letter from the Tighe family saying, "Is there any way you could change the name in the paperback? Because we find it terribly embarrassing." Because in fact, Brigadier General Tighe was a raging alcoholic and was drunk most of the time, which is probably why we lost the battle. But I declined because of this obsession that I had then to make my fiction so real that people began to doubt its fictiveness. And The Ice Cream War was a great success for me, interestingly. It was my second novel, as I say, published in 1982. Not far off the 40th anniversary of that one either. And it had another effect on my life in that it became a huge success in France. It became a huge bestseller in the translated version of An Ice Cream War, which is called Comme neige au soleil, like snow in the sun. And that success was down to one man, a man called Bernard Pivot, who had a television program on French television on Friday nights that lasted 2 hours. It was live TV, 2 hours of discussion between Pivot and 4 or 5 writers. I was invited on this show. It's in French as well, so that was a bit daunting. And I think what happened was that Pivot sensed my anxiety, and so he went a bit mad. He said, he held up the copy of the book like that, and to address the camera, and he said, "I've enjoyed this book so much that I will personally reimburse anyone who doesn't agree with me." You could hear people falling off their chairs in the audience. My editor in France practically fainted. And it became a news event because he never, ever expressed an opinion, Pivot. He was scrupulously neutral with all his guests, but he lost the plot with me. And the book became an enormous bestseller in France. It sold 100,000 copies in the first year and was in the top 10 for weeks and weeks. So a young author that I was then, just in my early 30s, I couldn't believe my luck. And of course, I started doing the calculations, 100,000 copies at 20 francs a copy. I was owed a great deal of money. And of course, being a young person, not thinking ahead, I started to spend that money before it arrived. And the problem with foreign royalties is they always come 2 years after publication. So I had a long wait for the French money to arrive, but I knew exactly when it was due, and it never showed up. So I called my agent, and I said to her, where's the French money? I mean, there must be a lot of it. When's it due? I mean, I'm living off it already, and it hasn't arrived. And she said, let me get onto it, I'll chase it up. And I'll never forget that day. It must have been 1985 by this time. A phone call rang in our house. I picked it up. It was my agent. And she said, hello, Will. Bad news, I'm afraid. My publisher had spent it all. Second slide. Can you see that clearly? That's a group of French writers outside the Brasserie Lippe on Boulevard Saint-Germain in Paris in, I think, the autumn of 1985, just after a year or so after my enormous success with Comme Neige au Soleil. Sorry, beg your pardon. There I am, young lad, full head of hair. And that man on the very fringe, on the right, as you look at the man on the very edge of the frame in the sheepskin coat is my publisher, André Ballon. This is the only photograph I have where we're both in the same shot. The young guy there in the V-neck sweater has just won the Prix Goncourt, so he's very happy. But it was a jolly occasion, and in a way it was a symbol of how well I had done, and that I, a British novelist, was invited into this rather august French celebration. But with wisdom of hindsight, I can now see that André Ballon is rather unwilling to be photographed, and he's sort of edging out of the frame because he knows he owes me a lot of money, and he hasn't got it. In fact, he owed me £85,000 in royalty payments. That's only 10% of the money that the publishing company and booksellers had made. And when my agent went over to Paris to beard him and say, where's Boyd's money, he just disappeared out the back door. And she came back empty-handed. And luckily, I'd become very friendly with my translator, a remarkable woman called Christiane Bess. And she said, look, you're just going to have to sue him in order to get some money. Otherwise, you'll never get it. And in fact, even André Ballon, who I'd started writing to, said, look, you'd better sue me because the banks own my company. He wasn't that apologetic, actually. It was like, ça va, ça arrive, so I did sue him. I hired a very brilliant French lawyer who reassured a woman called Madame Veil, and she said, we will win, she said, because it's theft, pure and simple, but it's going to take a long time. French justice, is implacable but slow. So I sued Ballon, and I won. He appealed, so I had to sue him again. He then discovered that he'd sold off part of his publishing company to a Parisian taxi firm. Madame Veil said, well, you have to sue the taxi firm as well. Of course, French lawyers don't even open a file unless you've paid them money in advance. So I was already spending money on my lawsuit. And 2 years went by, case came to court, I won, the taxi company appealed. By now, I think they had stolen my paperback rights, my book club rights, so the figure that they owed me was even more substantial than the 85,000 that I thought I had been robbed of. Anyway, on it went for 11 years. I wrote a piece about it. It's in my collected non-fiction. It's called The 11 Years' War. And Madame Veil, was right that we did win all the time. We eventually ended up in the highest court in France, which is called the Cour de Cassation, where they just look for technicalities. They just look for punctuation errors or wrong statements. And I won that case, as I duly did, but it was 11 years after the initial litigation began. It sort of ended happily in the sense that the books that André Balland had published of mine, he published 3 books, I was able to get back free and sell to a new publisher called Le Seuil, who I'm still with, who are very honest and upstanding and pay their royalties on time. And that was an end of it, except André Balland, the man in the sheepskin coat on the edge of the picture there, went bust. His publishing company still exists, but he has nothing to do with it. And he decided to become a novelist and started writing crime novels. And he ended up being published by Le Seuil, my publisher. And I remember saying to my editor, does he come by the office from time to time? She said, oh yes, André pops in all the time. I thought to myself, what would I do if I bumped into André in the lobby of Le Seuil in the Rue Jacob? Would I just shrug and say, ça va, André, or would I nut him? I don't know. It never actually happened. But I never met him again, and he's now gone on to the great publishing house in the sky, which is why I can traduce him in this way for his dishonesty. But it was an example of that moment in a publishing writer's life when great good fortune seems to be arriving on your doorstep, but don't count your chickens is the motto. All's well. My books still sell extremely well in France. All the 3 that Balland published are in print and selling. I think I did lose quite a lot of money because we couldn't get most of it back. But in the long term, I won. But it was a salutary lesson for me, and I realized that publishing doesn't always go the way you expect it to. The Ice Cream War was the beginning of this attempt to make fiction so real that you forget it's fiction. And I carried on working in this vein. And then I think the most crucial example of the success of the enterprise happened a few years later, in 1995. I had joined the board of an art magazine, because I write a lot about art. And I was asked if I would join the board, and there was an editorial board meeting. So I went along to this restaurant and was directed to the upstairs room where the editorial board was sitting, and the two new members of the board were going to be formally welcomed to the magazine. And to my astonishment, I saw that the other new member of the board was in fact David Bowie. Yes, that's David Bowie. And because we were the 2 new members, we sat beside each other at the board meetings, and we continued to sit beside each other at subsequent editorial meetings and editorial dinners and so on. So sort of in the way you can only sort of get to know somebody that famous, I sort of got to know David Bowie. And one day at one of these meetings, the editor of the magazine said, how do we get fiction into a serious art magazine? And I put up my hand and said, pretty much spontaneously, why don't I invent an artist? And she said, well, that's a great idea. So I did invent an artist. I went away and I made up an artist who I called Nat Tate. And I decided to be an American artist who was painting in the 1950s, that sort of era, in New York. And I would write a parable of his life that would be a kind of fairy story of the art world, that Nat Tate, who was not a very good artist, met 2 geniuses, Picasso and Georges Braque, realized his own work was sub-average, decided to destroy as much of it as he could, and then committed suicide by jumping off the Staten Island ferry in 1960. So I wrote this piece, and it was published in the magazine, and it was copiously illustrated with photographs and captions and a few surviving examples of Nat Tate's work. And I had also, in a more elaborate scheme to make the hoax seem more real and less fictive, I had approached two well-known people that I knew and asked if they would be sort of covert supporters of the hoax. One of them was Gore Vidal, the American novelist, and I asked Gore if he would remember meeting Nat Tate in the 1950s and recounting a little anecdote about that meeting. And Gore, being a very good sport, said, yes, sure. So he sent me this little reminiscence. I met Nat Tate. He was a good-looking boy. He drank too much. He had an affair with Peggy Guggenheim, etc., etc. Put that in the article. And then I asked another friend of mine, art critic called John Richardson, and John is the world expert on Picasso, and he knew Picasso. So I said to him, John, could you remember introducing Nat Tate to Picasso, and then giving another introduction for Nat Tate to meet Georges Braque at his studio? So John said he would, another good sport, and he remembered the dinner where Nat Tate met Picasso and said he didn't say very much, he seemed a bit overawed, and then Nat Tate went to Georges Braque's studio and was overwhelmed by the work Braque was doing. Enter David Bowie. He said, I think we should have a picture of Nat Tate, actually. He said, there he is. It's the only surviving photograph of Nat Tate, taken in London in the late 1950s. David Bowie said, why don't we publish this little essay as a book? And I said, that's a great idea. He had a little publishing company called 21 Publishing. And he set the whole thing in motion. The book was beautifully printed in Germany. And then Bowie said, let's have a launch party. One in New York and one in London. Make it as glamorous as possible. And we'll just present the book. I said, great idea, David, let's do it. And so we did do that. David Bowie arranged for there to be a big party in the studio of Jeff Koons, the American pop artist. And very few people knew that the whole Nat Tate thing was fake. This is pre-Google. It wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes today. But back in 1998, which was when we did all this, it was entirely possible to present a story like this, full of acknowledgements, footnotes, all the paraphernalia of a little beautiful art monograph, and sort of get away with it. Bowie actually wrote the blurb of the book as well, in which he claimed to own a Nat Tate, which was another, to adding Gore Vidal, John Richardson, David Bowie. Any skepticism you might have as a reader would kind of, wouldn't survive in the face of this hard evidence to the existence of Nat Tate. So there was this huge party in Jeff Koons' studio. I think about 200 people were invited, all the glitterati, the great and the good of the art world. It's one of these legendary parties where people say, oh, Brad Pitt was there. I don't know, but lots of people were there, lots of intellectuals and critics and so on. Who wouldn't go to a party in Jeff Koons' studio hosted by David Bowie? And what happened then was that Bowie read out extracts from the book to the assembled guests, deadpan. Didn't say anything more about it. But the trouble was that one of the conspirators was the art critic of the independent newspaper, a man called David Lister. And David Lister took it upon himself to go around the crowd of guests asking people if they'd ever heard of Nat Tate. And of course, people being people said, why, yes, of course. What a tragedy, he died so young. I seem to remember the show in Philadelphia as vividly as if it was, yes, people just dug holes for themselves and jumped in. And Lister couldn't believe his good fortune. And we were about to do exactly the same thing a week later in London. Very glittery party, lots of young British artists invited in a sort of a new restaurant that was opening. And I had been interviewed on the radio and in the press about this amazing discovery I'd made. I was beginning to feel quite nervous, actually, because basically I was lying. But then that's what novelists do. They're beautiful lies and elaborately constructed. And I was feeling very uneasy about it until David Lister decided that it was too big a story. And so he broke it. And the headline on the Independent, front page of the Independent, was "British Novelist Fools Manhattan Art World," which is not true, but it made a good headline. I don't know how many people were fooled, but it became a 24-hour news event. And I was interviewed on Newsnight by Jeremy Paxman, who said, "How could anybody be convinced by those appalling drawings?" But of course, lots of people had been convinced. Here's an interesting shot of the party. There's David Bowie, cigarette in hand, and there's a copy of Nat Tate that he published. And that man over his shoulder there, his right shoulder, is Jeff Koons, who's looking a little bit uneasy because he didn't know that the whole thing was a hoax and that Nat Tate had never existed. It was I think there's a bit of a falling out between Bowie and Jeff Koons after that, in fact. But anyway, it became a huge hoax. And, we'd had the party on April 1st, just to rub it in. And it, as I say, became a news event. I was slightly irritated because I wanted it to be more of a slow burn. I wanted maybe after 2 or 3 months somebody to challenge me about the veracity of this life I'd invented, but it was all over and done in about 4 or 5 days, except the story wouldn't go away. I think the reason is that everybody loves a hoax, and particularly if you're hoaxing, pretentious intellectuals, even better. Also because of the presence of Bowie, it made it sort of glamorous. And I think Bowie loved the Nat Tate hoax. It sort of fitted in with his own kind of chameleon nature and his own sense of fun and license. And he relished his role in it. But I think it's because of his role that it refused to go away. We made 3 television documentaries about Nat Tate, believe it or not. The book has been translated into French, Spanish, Italian, and German, and every time it's translated, there's a huge explosion of interest. I am a hoaxer now, so anytime there's a hoax in the world, I'm rung up by newspapers to ask what it's like to be outed and all that sort of thing. So it became something out of my control. I began to feel like Dr. Victor Frankenstein, who'd created this monster, Nat Tate. There he is. And he wouldn't go away. And I remember at the German publication, there was an incredible fuss in Germany about the German translation of the book. I was on television, and I was interviewed in a very cool art gallery in Berlin by the editor of a very serious art magazine about art and fiction, and audience of 300 people. And behind me on the wall was a giant portrait of Nat Tate, about 20 feet high, over the back of my shoulder. I was getting a crick in my neck. And I was thinking, this is ridiculous. This is getting totally out of control. Here I am talking about this creature I've invented as if he actually existed, and there's his photograph. I thought, I have to drive a stake through his heart and bring about some sort of closure. And I wondered how best to do this. And then the idea came to me that I would do a Nat Tate drawing, because I was responsible for all the surviving artwork in Nat Tate's. I'd do a Nat Tate drawing and sell it at auction at Sotheby's, and somehow I thought the congruence of fake artists, fake art, real money would somehow, explode the story once and for all. And I knew somebody at Sotheby's, and I asked if they would play along with it, and they agreed. Another example of good sport. Everybody knew what the nature of the hoax was, and everybody knew I did the Nat Tate drawing. So I did a little drawing the size of a postcard of a sort of stylized bridge. Nat liked drawing bridges for some reason, and had it beautifully framed with a big museum mount, and I wrote a little essay for the catalogue. There it was in the catalogue, modern British painters sale, and it was, all very bona fide, and we had provenance, and we had a reserve of £3,000. That any money was not going to go to me, by the way. It was going to go to a charity, the Artists General Benevolent Fund, which is to help struggling artists. So the day of the auction came around, and again, masses of publicity. I was on television, articles in the newspaper, Nat Tate, Nat Tate, Nat Tate. And I was quite pleased. I thought, this is going to be the end of the story. Nat will be no more once his picture is sold. So we went into the auction house, the auction room, and bidding began, quite fierce, quite hot. And it was apparent there was somebody bidding on the phone who was determined to get this tiny little drawing. And eventually, bidding ended at £7,500, which is pretty good for fake art by a fake artist. And I said to the Sotheby's people, who was the bidder on the phone? Because there aren't many Nat Tates out there in the world, and I'd like to know who the owner of this. Said, well, we can't possibly tell you, I'm afraid, because it's, Sotheby's rules about anonymity and so on. But I said, look, please, would you ask the person, explain, etc., etc. So they did. And the word came back to me that the person who had bought the drawing was happy for the name to be given to the public. I said, what's his name? He said, Anthony McPartlin, who is Ant of Ant and Dec fame. And of course, Ant is an anagram of Nat. And Ant was in Australia doing I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. He was a great fan of my books, it turns out, and he wanted to own a Nat Tate drawing, and so had bid for it over the phone. And of course, this, in a way, was rather wonderful, but it completely defeated my object, and the story rumbles on and has rumbled on, and with the tragic death of David Bowie, his involvement in the Nat Tate hoax, his whole role as a journalist or an art journalist came to the fore again. And so I've sort of abandoned any hopes of bringing about closure or bringing my benign monster to some sort of timely end. I realize that actually it's out of my control. And in a way, it's a funny sort of vindication of my enterprise, my original enterprise, in the sense that I wanted to push fiction into the world of the real so much that people would begin to forget it was fiction. And in a way, the Nat Tate story is the perfect exemplification of that ambition, that Nat Tate is completely fictive, but somehow has become as real as Pablo Picasso in a funny sort of way. And I return to my original manifesto from time to time, and I deliberately didn't read out the last sentence of it for you, which I will do now, as it pertains very much to the Nat Tate story. Just to remind you that the key factor in fiction is to make your readers believe in the truth of your story. They must believe that what they are reading actually happened. And then the last question is, any means to this end is acceptable as long as it works. And clearly it does work, but sometimes it works just too damn well. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you for being here, and we'll take some questions and answers now, I think. But that's my talk over. Thank you. That's the drawing. Bridge number 114. It's the size of a postcard, by the way. So.
We have a Nat Tate on the screen. How wonderful. I love the Nat Tate story. Congratulations. That's brilliant. Can I also congratulate you, incidentally, on the critical reception of Trio, obviously. Has COVID been a good time for authors in the sense of, are people buying more books because they've got more time? Are authors writing more books because they've got more time?
I think the answer is yes to both. I mean, certainly authors are busy because our lives are kind of isolated and locked down anyway. And I've been very busy in this over this year because I delivered Trio in January, and so I've had a very active 2020. But I think people are reading more books. I saw a figure that book sales were up by 11%. This year, and sales of electronic books and audio books are up by even more. So there is a silver lining for writers, and maybe we've benefited from this need to fill the long hours of your lockdown days.
Well, there was that appalling decision by the Welsh government, if I remember that, to close bookshops because they weren't essential purchases or something like that. Terrible.
No, it's awful.
Misjudgment, most certainly. We do have some questions that have come in online. Can I just say that if there's about another 10 minutes if anyone wants to send in extra ones, but I will go through the ones we have. This is from Mark Griffin. Thank you, Mark. I was interested to see you name the Book Nook bookshop in Hove. This has only been a children's bookshop for about 10 years. Previously, it was a beauty salon. Quite an interesting and complicated question, this one. How did you come about using this name for the bookshop in Trio? The current Book Nook owners are anxious to know.
And are you sure that's not a hoax question?
Well,
it has. I mean, I do check these things, and I'm sure that, but who knows? I just made up the name, plonked it down in a certain area. But actually, I think it is because I think the street I put it down in is a fictitious street. So I'm wondering if there is a book nook. And I consulted a Hove expert when I wrote the book. He read the book looking for errors and looking for things that wouldn't work. But so I'll have to go away and check that out. I'm slightly worried now because if it is a coincidence, it's a pure coincidence. Because I thought surely nobody in their right mind is going to call the bookshop the Book Nook. It was 1968 after all. But anyway, I will. But I have a feeling that somebody's winding me up.
Someone's playing you at your
Yes.
own game, are they? Yes. Here we are. Right. This is a little bit more straightforward, and I suspect genuine. It's from Ali. Which of all your books have you enjoyed writing the most?
Well, I've got a very boring answer to this. I've enjoyed writing them all, and it's largely because of my methodology. I think that, as I sort of alluded to in my talk, that I don't start a book until I've figured the whole thing out. And that period, which I call the period of invention, is actually usually longer or much longer than the period of composition, of writing the book. And so I make all my mistakes while I'm thinking about it rather than while I'm writing it. And consequently, I've never abandoned a novel. And I've never felt that any of the novels I've written aren't how I wanted them to be. There are no runts in my litter, as it were. And I look back at the 16 novels, and I feel fondly about them all. And I remember writing them all. And I remember the fun I had. I had great fun writing Trio. I mean, I suppose when you're writing a comic novel, and Trio is a comic novel with sort of dark undercurrents, perhaps you have slightly more fun. But then all my novels are, in a way, comedies, I think. In the same way that Anton Chekhov said, all my plays are comedies, all my tragedies are fundamentally comedies. It's just the comic vision suits me. So I really enjoy the whole process. I mean, some of my longer novels, I look back at the 500 pages, I look back at and think, how the hell did I manage to do that? Because they were hard work, but there's no sense in which it's a miserable business, And I was once asked by somebody as a question, have you ever suffered for your art? And I thought, I don't dare say yes, because if you are in a position to be a writer and to write novels that you want to write and to have them published, then all the kind of grumbles you may have are completely insignificant. So I genuinely have enjoyed the whole process. I'm not fraught, I'm not neurotic about it. And so the actual business of dreaming up and researching and putting a novel together and writing it is sheer pleasure in a way, even though there are problems along the way in terms of problems of structure or cadence or how do you end one chapter and start another, but that's just part of the technical side of writing. But the actual experience of going to your room and sitting down, and I write in longhand actually, so my first drafts are always pen on paper, is a pure pleasure, and long may it continue.
Is that pleasure at all linked to research you might do for a book? Because often, a lot of your stories are clearly set in exotic or interesting places, certainly not your home.
Yes.
So I presume you have to go and do all the research, so that must be part of the joy.
Yes, I mean, I'm not an autobiographical writer. I like to invent. I like to use my imagination and send my imagination out to discover things. And every novel, in a way, is an education as well. And all my novels are quite different from each other. And I have to discover things that are necessarily there to underpin the reality of the world I'm creating. So I do learn a lot. And I learned a lot about Brighton, for example, writing trio. I learned about its history and its redevelopment. I learned a lot about movie making in the 1960s, which was quite different from my experience of making films. So every book is an education. Some are more thorough than others. I've written a book about a primatologist, so for a while I was an expert on chimpanzees. But it's part of the pleasure quotient. You're right. I think that thinking of the book you're writing, or I'm thinking now of the book I'm going to write next, and I have a feeling it's going to be another long one, and so I've got a lot of work to do, a lot of reading and thinking, and maybe a bit of traveling, and if we can travel anymore. But that process is an entirely enjoyable one.
I've got a feeling your next book's going to have to be based within 5 miles of your home, actually. But
yes. No, don't worry. This is a great thing about time travel in novel writing. I'm going far away from 2020, backwards, so no worries about that.
Here we are. You sort of alluded to this a moment ago from Jeremy. I believe you worked with Sean Connery, who, as I'm sure you know, died today. What are your memories of him?
Yes, I did work with Sean Connery. I actually had met him socially, as they say. He was a friend of mine, and I met him, at a dinner party and chatted to him. And because of that meeting, I was able to get a screenplay I'd written based on my first novel, Good Man in Africa, to him directly. That was the great stroke of luck. And he read it and he liked it. In fact, he was perfect casting to play a rather dour Scottish doctor. He agreed to be in the film, and because he agreed to be in the film got made.
Yes.
We shot the film Good Man in Africa in the early 1990s in South Africa. And had about 10 days filming, and he came out, and in the film he gets to play golf. He was a great golfer.
He must have been so happy.
And then he got to play a round of golf with Gary Player as well, which made him very happy. But he was delightful. We had dinner with him every night. He hung out with the crew. It was a very well-run film. I think he's a real pro. If things weren't running smoothly, he would quickly let you know. And he was delighted with the finished film, even though it wasn't. I give it 6 out of 10, I think, in my particular rating system. But hey, we made it, and because of that, I got to know him and his wife Micheline. And when I directed my first film in 1998, it was screened at the Edinburgh Film Festival, and I think Sean was the patron of the festival. And I met him there again, and I said, we're having this screening. So he said, can I come along and see it? It's like the King of Scotland saying, can I come see it? So I said, yeah, that'd be fantastic. So he came along to see the film, and this is the funny thing with hindsight. The star of the film was a then unknown actor called Daniel Craig, who I had cast in this film. It's a war movie. It's a First World War movie called The Trench. I call it an art house war movie, low-budget war movie. And Daniel played the sergeant of this unruly platoon of youngsters. But it's the one occasion, I think, I'm pretty sure, that where I introduced Sean Connery to Daniel Craig, who, of course, had no idea at all in 1998 that he would end up being James Bond himself. But it was typical of Sean's good nature and to go out of his way to come to a pretty obscure screening in a small cinema in Edinburgh and meet the cast. But in fact, that meeting was curiously significant.
Fantastic. You mentioned your rating system, and I'm interested in that. So you gave the film 6 out of 10. Is it cheeky to ask what you've given Trio?
Well, no, it's only the films I make. I mean, my novels are all 10 out of 10.
Of course,
fabulous success. No, but it's tricky because I mean I love working in film and I love working in theatre because I like collaborating, but it's not autonomous in the sense that writing a novel is entirely your responsibility. Film is a collaborative art form, and it should be recognised as such. And the contributions to films that I think are that I've written that are very successful are not down to me entirely. The acting, the directing, sometimes the score, all these things contribute to the success of a film. But something didn't quite gel in A Good Man in Africa, and but it was it's maybe it'll have a little revival. It's part of Sean's filmography, but. No, I think it's you have to be honest with yourself, and not everything you do is going to be perfect, and you have to assess where it doesn't quite click.
No, it's a very complex chemistry, isn't it? This is from Colin. Have you changed the way you write over your 40 years as a novelist?
That's a good question, actually, because I think I have, but I don't think I've changed the kind of novelist I am. But I think that it's like anything. The more you do, in theory, the better you get. And so I think my competence as a novelist has got better as I've written more novels. And the sort of technical craft side of novel writing is something that I can see I do better now than I did when I first started out. And so I think that the learning curve I'm on, it pays off in the novels that I write, and that Trio is me firing on all cylinders at the moment, and my next novel may be slightly better with a bit of luck, but it's a kind of professional assessment of your competence and expertise that goes on. And I think if you looked at A Good Man in Africa, 1981, you looked at Trio, you'd see there was a difference in perhaps in not so much the style, but maybe the confidence of the way the narration is handled, and the way my expertise and my ability to learn has manifested itself in the novels as they go on.
Do you challenge yourself with the structure? In other words, sort of timelines, complexity, multiple plots?
Yes, because I like complex narratives and I like complex, compelling stories. And actually, it's very difficult to write a compelling story that will keep readers engaged for 350 pages. It's far too easily dismissed storytelling. And so I often fracture narrative. I often have multiple narrators, as I have in this novel. And so there are, in all the novels I've written, quite interesting technical issues that have to be solved. Perhaps the most tricky novel I wrote was Any Human Heart, which is a 500-page novel written in the form of an intimate journal. Well, as we all know, anyone who keeps a diary, sometimes they're incredibly boring documents. But actually, to be an authentic diary, Any Human Heart had to be quite boring at times. So in a way, to make the diary entries, the journal entries, look authentic and real, it took a lot of effort to kind of mess with the art in a way.
To make it slightly dark.
Yes, exactly. And so it would have the texture of a real intimate journal.
Actually, there's a question here about Any Human Heart from Haley. I was captivated by Any Human Heart. It sounds as though you both really love classical music and know how to take a piano apart.
Well, that's not Any Human. That's Love Is Blind.
Oh, really? Goodness. Right. Well,
that's my penultimate novel. Yes, I do love classical music, but the central character of Love Is Blind is a piano tuner, and I know absolutely zero about piano tuning, but I was lucky enough to meet a great piano tuner who was so thrilled that somebody was writing a novel about a piano tuner, he allowed me to pillage his brain absolutely. So I owe everything to do with the kind of secret art of piano tuning to Clive Ackroyd, who's the chief piano technician at the Royal Academy of Music, who told me everything about his profession and its dark arts, because there are secrets in piano tuning. Yes. And I remember I once said to Clive, because I said, could you sabotage a piano in a concert, do you think? And he said, oh, yes. I've been tempted many times. So he told me a very good way of sabotaging a piano.
Very good. And it appears in Love Is Blind.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Oh, here we go. Mark Griffin, this is not a hoax. The bookshop does actually exist.
Well, it's a fair cop. How extraordinary. Life imitating art yet again. How amazing.
I've got a feeling this is slightly cheeky as well. From Tom, would you rather be known as a painter or a writer?
Well, that's an easy one to answer. I mean, I initially, when I was about 17 or 18 and you're beginning to think, what the hell will I do with the rest of my life? I thought I wanted to be a painter, and I thought briefly of going to art school, but the parental hand barred the way, and so I switched to literature. But being a writer is absolutely fantastic. But you're an artist as well, and Vladimir Nabokov, one of my favorite writers, said that when you set out to write a novel, you're trying to create a work of art, but in your particular medium. So it's that artistic ambition is satisfied, even though I'm not putting oil paint on canvas.
Yes, I mean, it's an incredibly imaginative world. You create a world every time you write a novel, don't you?
Yes, or a short story or a screenplay or whatever. It's constant invention.
Now, we don't really have time for one final question, but there is one final question, so we'll make time for it. Would you ever, all right, okay, Haley, again, would you ever set a novel around the dramas of 2020?
I don't, now, at the moment, I don't think I would, actually. And I think one of the problems about writing a novel that's completely contemporary, like writing a COVID novel, is that you kind of build in its obsolescence, and that in 3 years' time or 5 years' time, it won't seem interesting or significant, and you'll need a footnote to explain what happened and who said what. So I think, and you look at, I think taking a novel back in time, even 5 years or 10 years, is a very good idea because everything is fixed. Whereas we don't know what the outcome of this crisis is going to be. So anybody trying to write about it is either going to have some kind of seer-like prescience or else going to look very stupid.
Yes.
So the answer is no, but maybe in 30 years' time, somebody might write a novel that's set in 2020, in the same way as James Joyce wrote Ulysses 20-odd years after the year in which it's set, same way George Eliot wrote Middlemarch 30 years after the year. I think fiction needs time to pass, otherwise it becomes ephemeral or obsolete very quickly.
And you need to pick up, actually, with the deeper perspective, what was significant
yes,
at that
exactly.
time.
And you just, it's like writing a novel about the 9/11 attacks. I still think it's probably too early though many American novelists have tried it, I still think it's probably too early to really fix that historical moment.
Well, we ran out of time 5 minutes ago, but I didn't want to stop this because it's such a pleasure to have you with us. Congratulations again on the book. I was going to say it is available in all good bookshops, including the Petworth Bookshop, except you tell me that it's already sold out. So
it's now back. There was a moment where it sold out, which it sounds like good news, but actually it's bad news for the novelist. No, it's available in all good bookshops up until Thursday, I believe.
Oh, yes.
No, it's and can be bought anywhere. But no, it's no more stock issues, I'm glad to say.
I'm delighted to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, what a great pleasure, what a privilege for us to have this as your sole live literary festival appearance this year. Thank you so much, William Boyd.
Thank you.
You've been watching an event that's part of this year's Petworth Festival Autumn Special. And many, many thanks to our many sponsors who've helped make the festival happen at all. I hope you'll agree that we've managed to keep tickets at a very reasonable price for this event. And I also hope you'll agree that it's vital that organisations such as the Petworth Festival continue to exist so that we can provide festivals year on year and provide work for our wonderful artists and performers. If you are able to help by making a small donation, please do so. As I'm sure you know, every little helps. If you can, please do. Thank you.